All right, good evening. Let me call to order this meeting of the City of Bloomington Plan Commission for March 10th, 2025. Let me start with just a quick overview of our agenda this evening. We have a few petitions that are tabled, one that's been tabled for quite a while. That's Cutters Kirkwood 123 LLC, SP 24-22. We also have ZO 34-23, these text amendments to the UDO that have been tabled as well as ZO 0125 and ZO 0325. Those are all tabled. Petitions that we will hear this evening, there are 4 of them. ZO 0625, ZO 0725, ZO 0825, and ZO 0925. These are all technical corrections to various chapters of the UDO brought by the City of Bloomington Planning and Transportation Department. So it should be pretty smooth sailing since it's all in the family here. But let's start with calling the roll, make sure that we have a quorum here tonight.
Enright Randolph?
Here.
Seabour?
Here.
Korodke?
Here.
Kinsey?
Here.
Smith?
Here.
Stossberg?
Here.
And Whistler.
Did you say?
Whistler.
Oh,
yeah.
yes, here. I am here. All right. We do have 2 sets of minutes to be approved. We have minutes from the November 4th, 2024 meeting and the February 10th, 2025 meeting. Are there any corrections or questions from commissioners about those minutes? Commissioner Stossberg, go ahead.
I emailed a couple of comments. Did those get looked at and incorporated?
Yes. So correction for spelling for Mr. Weichert, and we will note the time on the adjournment for the second set as well.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
All right. Any other questions, corrections, or a motion to approve?
Move to approve.
Second.
Both?
Do we have, we don't,
Can we do both?
I think we can do a, your motion to
My
approve
motion is
both?
for both.
All right. And we don't have any remote participants tonight, so we can just do a voice vote on this. The motion is to approve both November 4th and February 10th minutes. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Say nay. All right, the minutes are approved. We'll go now to reports, resolutions, and communications. Are there any reports from commissioners? Commissioner Stossberg.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to let fellow commissioners know that our agenda on Wednesday for City Council includes 2 resolutions to request the Plan Commission to make changes to the UDO. So I'm just going to kind of summarize the synopses. The first one is sponsored by Councilmember Flaherty, and it's regarding making changes to sustainability initiatives and PUD requirements for building electrification, elimination of minimum parking requirements, and a reduction of minimum lot widths, lot areas, and building setback requirements. So that's one of them. And the other one is sponsored by Councilmember Rosenbarger, and it generally wants to allow for more housing options to fill in missing middle gaps, specifically calling for amendments that expand uses and remove restrictions for plexes, some ADU requirements, and ADU size, and expanding cottage developments. So FYI, that's coming, and so I would encourage commissioners to follow along with that meeting on Wednesday night. You can come in person at 6:30, or it's also available online via Zoom, and you can also watch it later via the CATS recording. I don't know the results, of course, of these, but if it does end up coming before us with a positive, from council, it might be useful for commissioners to have listened to council member comments and also public comment. Thanks.
Thank you. Any questions for for Commissioner Strasburg regarding that? I've got a couple, if you would indulge me.
Sure, I don't know if I can necessarily answer them, but.
Just, first of all, these are resolutions that are just being considered on Wednesday. We won't see them unless, of course, they
Right,
pass on
right,
Wednesday.
right.
But maybe a question for staff. Have you seen the draft of these resolutions?
Yes, the council packet went out on Friday, so we have looked at that.
So my primary question is on the second one as it relates to the missing middle. In the last go-around, the Plan Commission passed a version of some of these things that was then kind of walked back when it got to council in terms of making plexes a conditional use and not a accepted use and so forth. Can you speak to what's in this resolution? How similar is it to what we already passed a few years back in our, or is there brand new things that we haven't contemplated before?
Sure. Jackie Scanlon, Assistant Director. It is similar. I have read it, but they are proposing, so similar that they would be permitted in the R1 through R4, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes. I don't think you all had done permitted for all three in all four districts, so that's a little bit different. They are also proposing changes to the use-specific standards, specifically some of the architectural ones, and when that came out of Plan Commission in 21, you guys were okay with those staying in. And then they are also proposing to remove the requirement for separate utilities, which you'll see tonight. We have also proposed that as well as part of our annual update for various reasons. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, it's a similar idea of allowing them to be more permitted in more places than they are now.
Okay, thank you. Any other reports from commissioners? Or you have a question?
No, I have a report, actually.
Go ahead.
If nobody else has questions. So just want to report out to both the commission and anyone in the public who missed the February 14th, 2025 Bloomington Monroe County Metropolitan Planning Organization Committee meeting, or the meeting of that body. I am representing the Plan Commission at that meeting, and I was really struck by our adoption of the Metropolitan Transportation Plan for 2050. And it's an extensive document. It went through a lot of community input, and it was really, an extensive, not only effort, but also really drew some important conclusions. And that now it's part of a federal mandate, is my understanding, for a 20-year planning horizon. And my understanding is that now it goes to Indy, and then I don't know if anyone knows what happens after it goes to Indy for kind of state-level review or enactment. But I thought there were some really instructive Plan Commission guidance from it. And when I asked the representatives from the group about this, a couple stood out, and I just wanted to share those, in terms of what we can learn from the extensive public input. This went through, for those of you who are following, went through a long period of public comment and good public input. And the conclusion, the simple synopsis from this was that the public wants safety, multimodal mobility, crosswalk safety, curbs, and ramps. And to me, it was really orienting in some ways to see that extensive public input and to remind us just about the relationship between transportation planning and land use that we are governing. So just wanted to say that it's a really, I think, valuable document for us to have and to think about, and hope the public reads it as well. That's it.
Thank you. Any other reports from commissioners? Any reports from staff?
We are going to have a report from Planning Services Manager Ryan Roebling. I wanted to quickly say on the agenda, I think there's a word missing here, and just so the public knows that the ZO01-25 and the ZO03-25 are just continued. If you'll recall, last month, so the word continued is missing. ZO01-25, we had talked about putting on the agenda tonight. But we are working with the rest of the administration and the Housing and Neighborhood Development Department on that, and so it's not ready yet. And the other one as well will come forward on a later date. So I just wanted to correct that. Sorry, that was confusing. And I think Mr. Roebling has a report. Thanks.
Yeah, if I might just, on that note, we have had several conversations with staff and with the mayor. The mayor is working on a few internal process changes that I think are closely related. And so I think it made sense for us to wait till those are settled, because I think that will help inform some of the policy decisions that we might want to make in that working group going forward. So if you hadn't heard that already, it's not because anybody's ignoring the issue. There's a lot of work going on, and we just want to make sure that whatever we implement is working well with the process changes that may be going into effect here. So, thanks. Mr. Roebling, go ahead.
Ryan Roebling, Planning Services Manager. I would like to thank Commissioner Kinsey for teeing me up. I have a request for all of you. So as you know, we recently amended the city's transportation plan to include the Safe Streets and Roads for All Safety Action Plan, which outlines steps to eliminate fatal and serious injuries, crashes by 2039. One of those key action items was to create a transportation commission, which would review and approve transportation projects. In February, Council voted to approve that creation of that Transportation Commission. 4 seats were reserved for members of other key bodies, including 1 from Plan Commission themselves. So the Transportation Commission will function similarly to how Plan Commission works, but for transportation projects. It will review major projects, serve as a steering committee for transportation planning initiatives, and make recommendations on policies and code changes, much like Plan Commission reviews building designs and planning documents and Title 20 changes. So tonight I'm asking a Plan Commission member to volunteer to serve on the new commission. I know that the first question you're all asking is about time commitment. While an exact schedule hasn't been created, we plan to collaboratively set an agenda or a schedule with the new members of the commission. So our goal is to hold effective meetings without hindering anyone's schedule or spreading you all too thin. The new commission, essentially, we aren't sure what it looks like yet, and we want to make that decision with the new commission members. So the few initial meetings are already planned for placeholders. That would be Monday, April 14th and Monday, May 19th. But after that, again, we're going to have that conversation with the new commission. And then the engineering department will primarily staff the commission, but it will have support from planning and other departments. So anyway, I'm happy to answer any questions, but Mr. Seabour is also here to answer any questions about the new commission, and we look forward to having one of you on board. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any questions from commissioners about this new commission? Tron, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, and I'm a big advocate of, like working well with our political subdivisions, and I'm kind of curious, how are you going to create that collaboration with the county and even the town? I think it's really important, as we're talking about transportation, that some of these goals align, and I'm curious what, no pun intended, what the vehicle is going to be for that, and I'm hoping it's not just the MPO.
Currently, there is only the MPO. That is a great long-term goal. We don't have anything queued up for that, but that is something we should certainly talk about, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be really important, and even if they're just members, that with a non-voting member, I think it would be very helpful and proactive also, and I think really benefit the community as a whole.
Yeah, I will say one of the roles of this new commission is to serve as a standing steering committee, and the new commission can make its own rules, and one of those I think we would advocate for is, for steering committee purposes at least, expanding to include extra members for, from the outside of just the city. Things like College and Walnut affect more than just the people who live here.
Thank you. Also, I have to say IU, I guess, is kind of their own entity around here, so appreciate that.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Any other questions from commissioners? Anyone ready to volunteer? No? All right, well, we'll come back to that. I assume we don't have to nominate someone tonight? Correct. Okay, good. All right, well, thank you for that. Any other reports from staff? All right, well, I think we then are on to our petitions for the evening. We'll start with ZO 0625, and looks like we have Jackie Scanlon to present.
Yes, Jackie Scanlon and Mr. Grulich is here to help me with some of these as well. Let me move this. Okay, so we are, this is our annual Unified Developments Title 20 update that we've been bringing to you now since the repeal and replace that was finished in 2020. So this year, it is again similar to last year, where it is mostly things that we are hoping to clarify or errors that we are correcting in the use of the code. So there are 4 petitions, and the first, as President Whistler said, is ZO 0625. This is our technical corrections petition. You had a packet, or I'm sorry, you had a table in your packet, and it's the first page. It's 7 corrections, and they are really all just incredibly technical this year. 2 spelling errors, mislabeling of tables, or a numbering system, and then the 2 that weren't just correcting spelling or numbering were that in our table for maximum number of parking spaces, the end of 2 phrases had been left off. So it is outdoor seating area 5 spaces per 1,000 square feet of, and then we've added outdoor seating area. So that's similar to the allowance for the indoor seating area and just needed to be clarified. And that is all we have for ZO 0625. I can answer any questions.
Are there any questions from commissioners?
And I should have clarified in the memo, didn't do a good job this year, that obviously we were recommending forwarding all of these to the council with a positive recommendation and waiver of second hearing. That was in the notice that went to the paper, but I did not clarify that well in the packet.
Thank you. No questions? All right, we'll go to public comment on ZO 06-25. If you'd like to make comment, if you're here in the chambers, step right up to the podium. If you're online, click the reactions button and click the raise hand option, and we will recognize you when it is your turn to speak. Last call for public comment on ZO 0625. Seeing none, we are back to the commission for any final comments or for a motion. As a reminder, the staff recommendation is that we forward ZO 0625 to the Common Council with a positive recommendation and waiver of second hearing.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. Please call the roll on the motion to forward
Thank you.
and waiver of second hearing.
Seabour? Yes. Korodke?
Yes.
Kinsey?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Stossberg?
Yes.
Whistler?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right. We'll wait for the sound to pass here for a second. All right, that motion passes. We are on now to ZO 07-25.
Okay, this is the bulkiest one that we have, so it won't go quite as quickly, probably. So it can if you want to, but ZO 0725 is update related to changes in Chapter 2 and Chapter 4. So It contains, I think, a total of just under 60 changes, 58 changes. And I'm happy to, and as we've done in other years, go through each one. I know that that isn't everyone's favorite thing. So I may just give a little synopsis of them, and then if you have particular ones from the table, that would have been on pages 7 through 12 in your packet. So if you had any highlighted from that that you wanted to discuss further, just let me know. Okay. I'll probably show a couple of these because they're just easier to show than describe. Oops, why is this being so goofy? I'm gonna get there. Alrighty. Okay, so in a couple of our districts, we added the allowance that if you are adjacent to a platted alley, you can see here number 3, side primary building setbacks shall be reduced by 2 feet if adjacent to a platted alley. Rear primary building setbacks shall be reduced by 10 feet if adjacent to a platted alley. So most of our platted alleys are between 12-ish and maybe 20 if it's a newer alley, but they're 10, 12. And so we have seen a number of variances over the years be approved by the Board of Zoning Appeals when someone is requesting a side or rear setback variance and they're adjacent to an alley, because the separation basically that the code is seeking and the setbacks is built in from the property adjacent. So we went ahead and put in some allowance for that to be reduced here while acknowledging that that they would still obviously have to have some setback. So we did that in a number of the districts. We also, let's see. In our more intense district, so residential high density, we copied something that is in our residential multifamily district, allowing for the front building setback to be determined by the standards of the base zoning district. So you may recall that we have added, and you can see here, that if you're doing single family or something like that, or plexes in one of our more intense residential districts, that you can use the R4 district standards. But we have found, just like with the pattern of development in these areas, that it makes more sense sometimes for the front setback to actually be what the base zoning district is. So we've added that into some of our more intense districts as a footnote there. We've done a couple things related to the exterior facades of buildings. So one example is enhanced exterior light fixtures, such as wall sconces or light coves, allowing those to count toward your pedestrian entrance requirements when you are developing non-single family. Let's see. And then allowing pedestrian entrances on facades located within 0 to 5 feet of the front property line, that those have to be recessed. That is language that's already in the downtown, and so adding that to the TRO as those two things work similarly. And then here is one that we didn't foresee until we saw it with development. Basically, this is the requirement that all portions of a building that face a street above a certain number of stories are stepped back. That's a requirement that you're familiar with. Well, in the districts where the height is low, they don't have a step back requirement, but if they use incentives, then they can be quite tall. So we updated that so that in those districts, if they do earn that extra height, they are stepped back as they are in the other districts. We also clarified that for pedestrian street lighting, that in the areas where pedestrian street lighting is required, that regulation is not, referencing other regular street lights that the city engineer and Board of Public Works will review separately for vehicular and safety travel. We had some more setback updates, let's see, later in the code. And if you're familiar with the code, you know that some things are duplicated. In Chapter 2, they're split up by district. In Chapter 4, all of the dimensional standards are located there. So some of those same footnotes that I mentioned earlier, those will reappear here on these tables in Chapter 4 as well. So those are listed as separate references. And we added that same base district zoning allowance to the MS zoning district as well. And you can see that here, that the MS is now able to use, would now be able to use the R4 zoning district for smaller developments. So the MS zoning district ideally is for larger student housing developments, but obviously some of it is already developed with single family, and so allowing for those R4 districts standards to apply allows for those smaller lots to be able to be developed easily without variance as well. We changed some of the, so Chapter 4 is largely about design standards, so clarifying setback standards for things that can protrude off of a building, such as awnings, balconies, canopies. We added, clarified that attached exterior stairs fit there as well. One that was of some discussion with this group last year, what is related to the riparian buffers. So this is what we've come up with, and we took this to the EC, and they were favorable to this change as well. So the way that the streamside, or the way that the buffers work for riparian buffer, there are 3 zones, and they're each 25 feet. But with this change, the main branches of Jackson Creek south of 2nd and Clear Creek south of Grimes would actually be 50 feet. So I don't know if you'll recall, but a number of years ago we changed that we'll be measuring from the center of the stream as opposed to the top of the stream bank, because sometimes that's hard to determine that exact location. And the Environmental Commission has been asking us to change that back. So this was kind of a compromise that we identified some places in town where that could actually be impactful, that change, and added extra space for those. Let's see here. We clarified something that some of these end up being kind of clarifications of policy that exists where code is slightly unclear. So for example, we added a section indicating that when you're looking at the driveway separation standards, that we are really looking at the driveways on the same side of the street. And that's something we've been doing in practice for some time. So codifying that so it can be clear for people as well. Another one related to right-of-way. This is in regard to placing new sidewalks. So in situations of limited existing right-of-way, clarifying that we would like a minimum 5-foot tree plot, and that any portions of the pedestrian facilities that are then pushed back onto the private property because of the tree plot would have to be within a pedestrian easement. More clarifications, and so some things, because they're referenced in more than one place, you'll see, for example, improved alley access requirement, which we already require in almost all of the residential districts. We are now adding to the mixed-use student housing district, because that area, because of the area that it's in, to the west of campus, has a lot of alleys, and because some of those properties are developed on a smaller scale, as they would be in some of the R1 through R4 districts, requiring alley access seemed to make sense there as well. We have a change related to the EV parking. Here we go. We had some discussion with enforcement staff and some changes that have been made or brought to light in the some of the ADA rulings, federal information. And so we are including that if more than 6 EV charging stations are required on a larger site, that at least one of them shall be van accessible. That's something that they are moving toward in wider regulations, so we are going ahead and including that. Again, more kind of building facade changes, clarifications about when transparent glass is required, which facades are required to have certain percentages of that glass. We tried to, in the landscaping section, put in some allowances for different types of trees. So we already have that built in some places. But for example, in the, oh, did I write down the wrong page maybe? Here we go. So in our species diversity section, we added in something related to the shrubs. So we already require species diversity for the trees, and so adding a similar regulation for the shrubs, but making it slightly less, slightly higher percentage, because sometimes those are more difficult to source. We also, again, tried to tackle some of our ground cover versus stone versus mulch, and allowing mulch to be used in defined paths with raised borders, no less than 4 feet wide. So some people, want to use mulch in their yards to delineate walking paths. Code really only allows mulch around plantings at this time. So making that clarification, and then also making a clarification about the diameter surrounding shrubs or grasses. That's something that we don't currently have. As we do enforcement, it becomes apparent occasionally that kind of mulch is being used as in lieu of something living, which makes sense in some places around plantings, but in other places has gotten kind of excessive. So just clarifying where that can be done. And then also referencing the utilities department stormwater design manual and the plants in that manual, so that those can be used, so that those can be compliant with the UDO as well. We also are proposing a change related to street trees and who gets to do the approval of whether or not we use tree grates in the downtown. So previously that was a member of the city engineering department staff, and that has been switched to the urban forester, as he's the one who would be taking those in, and so making comments on whether or not those are appropriate. We also included this year that you cannot have refuse areas or dumpsters within required buffer yards, so leaving those for plantings. And then for our vacant lot landscaping, excluding something that you maybe have seen on South Walnut, where currently, depending on the size of your parcel, you can add like planters along the edge and plant plants in those. And so kind of taking that out, we have had one site do it in probably a number of decades, and it was kind of a pain for them and a pain for us. And just having this, having those properties go by the rules of other properties, which is to just plant those plants in the ground, is what we're proposing. So removing the use of the raised planters. And then for a number of our signs, smaller signs, they did not have height maximums, and so our standard height maximum for our freestanding signs is 6 feet. So we went ahead and added that to those signs that were missing that reference. We are also allowing signs this year, proposing to add signs as allowable on fencing, which is currently not allowed in construction situations. So because as you know, that's kind of a common use of signs, and so then we wanted to make that easier for people, especially developing from out of town, to be able to have their safety signs and temporary signs and things on their fences without limitation. And then let's see here. We did some other sign things. One is limiting electronic reader boards on signs larger than 125 square feet. So that is new this year, and that will limit basically the size of electronic reader board that we can have on lawful signs in the city. And then we did some clarifications as well related to awning signs and how tall a sign can project above that. And we went with 1 foot there, and did some clarification about where particular signs can be located, for example, on non-residential multi-tenant centers. Not changing the policy, but kind of syncing the language with other standards. We added in clarification that if you're dedicating right-of-way, it should be fee simple, so that if the city were to take it in, it's not just an easement. And the last one for this chapter is related to the subdivision control portion of the UDO, and new utilities in subdivisions, and that those utilities have to be buried, which is pretty standard in something that was apparently missing from code. So that is this ordinance, and I'm happy to answer any questions or pull anything specific up that you have questions about. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. Are there questions from commissioners? Commissioner Kinsey.
All right, I have one about the use of stone. Okay, let me get to my page here. It has to do with the mulching. Wait a minute. Is the mulching only about path use, or am I on the next section already? That's about, I can't find it now. About stone.
Okay, so we took out, so you can see here in the packet on PDF page 228 is probably what you're looking at, I think. There are a number of changes here. So one is limiting how much space can be dedicated to those landscape beds on a property for our smaller uses, or sorry, for our less dense uses. Another is related to the diameter of mulching that's allowed that I mentioned. And then the one you're mentioning, I think, is except as provided above, decorative stone may not be used as ground cover. Is that the one you're referencing? Yes. So we have had a number of enforcement cases in the last couple years, maybe 5, but where someone has completely covered their whole property, either in mulch or in some cases stone. And so that presents some issues, one of which, especially in one particular site we had, was elevated. So then when it was just all falling off into the sidewalk and the tree plot and stuff. And it just code just does not allow for that, but we wanted it to be explicit. Because again, code really only talks about mulch and decorative stone in the context of around plants. So that's kind of the reading that we've had for a number of years. We made a change last year where we clarified that you can do the stone like around your buildings, like how people do. I think we left up to 2 feet. But this year we wanted to clarify, try to make even more explicit that it can't be used as ground cover, which is a defined term indicating like what you're doing on your property that's not, your buildings.
Thank you. I guess I wondered about the logic of adding that it is planted in some way. Like if that would also help clarify that it's not just supposed to be, I understand the mulch example used as a walking path, but I wondered if stone would also require that something be planted in it.
Right. So I think, let's see, hold on. I think in this proposal here, we are proposing to remove stone to be around plantings altogether. We are just asking for natural mulch.
Okay.
Because the wide variation of stone that we see on these sites, it's like, it's not, it's just, it's very wide, and then it's kind of hard because that is not a defined term, drawing the line between decorative stone and decorative gravel, and so we are proposing to remove that.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification.
Any other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Stussberg.
Hi, thank you. I have a few small things, probably. I think the first thing I want to know is about the stuff where you're adding the MS district into, I think it's mostly alley-related stuff. What was the rationale of why that was excluded before?
It wasn't excluded before, we just hadn't thought about it that much, or realized that there would be situations, when we rezoned a lot of the area, especially south of 17th Street as mixed-use student housing, we kind of expected that would take over as what the development pattern would see in that area. But that's not what happened. We see a lot of people renovating single-family houses or constructing a new single-family house. And as you look at that area, you see that there is a lot of that area that was platted with alleys and should be accessed from alleys, just like the rest of the core neighborhoods. So it made sense as we were adding in the language in the MS district to use the Plex, the single family, the R4 standards for plexes in the MS district, to bring with it the standard to use alleys for access as well.
Okay, thanks.
Again, alley access, gets drive cuts off the street, makes for a safer pedestrian experience,
Right.
safer vehicular experience. So it just kind of made sense to use that. You don't have that presence of alleys pretty much north of 17th Street. It's just south of 17th that you have platted alleys.
Okay, so you just hadn't thought of it before, it's not that it was specifically,
Yeah, I think when we did the rezone, a lot of these areas, so this regulation already existed, and a lot of these areas had this regulation before we did MS, and so it was just one that we didn't think through, like, oh, we should carry this over. And like Eric said, we do see, you know, conglomeration of properties, and, but we are also seeing development on some of the smaller parcels, so wanting to add that back in for less, you know, less drive cuts on these, what are, in some cases, pretty small roads.
okay, thanks. I have more too, if you want me to keep going. Okay. I guess I want a little bit more understanding, or maybe something visual about the changing the setbacks with the platted alleys. So just in terms of, I mean, so the setbacks are reduced by 10 feet, but I did not go through all of the pages of the UDO to figure out what they are now, and so then that reduction of 10 feet, like what would those setbacks be? How would that end up like looking or feeling? And just trying to, I just want a little bit more understanding about that change.
Yeah, so right now, the rear yard setback in most of the single-family districts is 25 feet. So that 10-foot reduction would take it down to 15 feet. So, you know, part of this is, you know, as Mrs. Scanlon mentioned during the discussion, you know, the presence of the alley accomplishes the goals of light and space and separation between buildings and other property lines, but it also helps increase the developability of a lot, so allows for more additions to properties that have already been developed with a house. And then the side yard setback, you know, it can be 8 feet, could be 6 foot. So the reduction of 2 foot for the side yard would give a 4 foot or maybe a 6 foot side yard setback. And again, you know, the presence of the alley accomplishes that separation that was envisioned and desired with those base setbacks.
Okay.
So this is only in the R3 and the R4, so that's in the mostly like gridded, platted areas. And so, you know, if the side yard setback is 5 feet, but they, you know, the way that their house is built, it may actually be closer than that, that we will basically allow them to do additions and things down to 2 feet.
Okay.
Because they're getting that separation, because that where that new wall is going is like 2 feet from a property line that's 10 feet from another property line. So it's not like being built super close to someone else's property.
Okay, so it also takes into account maybe some historically smaller lots
Yes.
or different, so
Yep.
it maybe conforms a little bit.
Yes, so like on the east side, like in Park Ridge and stuff, it's not those. It's
Right,
the ones primarily downtown and near West Side,
okay, thank
like
you.
Elm Heights and stuff.
If somebody else wants to go while I look for another one, that would be great.
Sure, I think I have a few just questions. So one of the sections is in the back out parking, I think on alleys, I think is what it's referring to. And it says, so parking spaces shall be designed to be no less than 45 degrees to the alley. How is 45 degrees measured? Like, I guess to me, I just always wrestle, like, what does that mean? And would you know what to do with it?
Yeah, sure. So this was basically to clarify that you couldn't do parallel spaces along an alley. So this was to require that there be some angle to it. So this would be 45 degrees from that angle to the alley, so perpendicular.
And this would be outside the alley right-of-way on a
Correct. This would
property.
be on the private property side, not encroaching on the alley. Yeah, so the UDO now says back out parking is allowed onto an alley, but we've had some discussions, interpretations of, you know, could that allow for parallel, and that was not the intent. You know, the intent was you back out directly into the alley, not just have, you know, a row of 8 parallel spaces along an alley, but there was not language that specifically said that, so we needed to clarify what that meant.
Okay. And then, tree grates, I guess the section about the subject to approval by the city urban forester, I guess I wasn't sure, is that referring to the tree grate or the street trees or the tree pit? Like what is ultimately subject to that approval? And just curious to make sure I'm understanding it.
Yeah, ultimately, it would be all of those things. So we know, would this be a situation where our urban forester would want a tree grate, where they would want a tree plot? What would the width of the tree grate be? What would the depth, what would the grate be over that? Obviously, that would be in communication with engineering and us as well, but ultimately, it would fall to him, since he would be the ones maintaining it, to make sure that what gets put in is appropriate for the location and species.
Okay. And then maybe it's a follow-up thing that we can touch, but I know that, so that changes subsection A, but section B about the same, or maybe it's different 'cause it's not tree grates, but it still says the engineer. And so just, maybe it's something we can talk about more, or maybe I'm not reading it all correctly. Where it says alternatives to street tree grates, it's still to the engineers. And maybe that's the way it was intended.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just something we can look at more.
I do think amending that would probably be appropriate if you wanted to do that.
I guess
Because the idea is, we've had some larger conversations about tree grates in the administration recently, like different things have happened, and I think that was part of, the idea was that the urban forester would be the one ultimately deciding the design of what the tree would live in based on, to hopefully have the healthiest tree possible. So I do feel like changing the B would probably make sense if you wanted to amend that.
And I guess a part of me wants to just further explore this with
Yeah,
our urban
sure.
forester and parks department, just
Yeah, and if you wanted to
personally, but
propose
others might
taking it
want to
out
clean.
or whatever also, or having it be both or something, that may be a wider discussion to bring back next year as well.
Okay. One last question, if that's okay. So the last one talking about all new utility lines, so this is in the subdivision section. Is that referring, most of what is in that section is about like storm, sanitary, and water, but it's not clear if this applies to just all new utilities shall be buried. Is that, how do I interpret?
Yeah, so the intention, obviously, water and sewer lines are naturally buried, so this is really to deal with electric lines. So we don't have a section of our code that deals with electric lines, so there was just a general statement put in a general section that talks about all utilities. So this, but, the intention obviously was to also apply to electric lines and, maybe anything else down the line.
Okay, so all new subdivisions, that's just the expectation.
And while this was common practice, there was nothing in the UDO that said that they had to do that. So we like to make sure that we cover ourselves in case there is a situation where it comes up, and, we do have language that gives clear guidance.
Thank you.
Other questions? Got anyone?
Yeah, kind of. I've been trying to look at it while you were having that discussion. I think that on the table, there's just maybe an error on page 11 on the two from talking about the awning signs. The bolded sentence is in the old language and in the new language, and I think that it just didn't get deleted.
Okay, yeah, you're talking about, okay, so I noticed today that the
Yeah.
the second from the bottom and the third from the bottom, the existing language isn't quite right. It looks like it was copied from a different section.
Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
will, but we will clear that up before council. I noticed that
Yeah.
as well today.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that's all of the ones on this petition that I had a question about.
These aren't in the code like that. I think you copied it from the.
For questions from commissioners? All right, we will then go to the public. If you would like to make public comment, please step to the podium, state your name. You'll have 5 minutes to speak. If you are joining us online, just click the reactions button and raise your virtual hand, and we will recognize you when it is your turn to speak. Do we have any online commenters? Last call for public comment. All right, we are back to the commission for any final discussion or for a motion. As a reminder, the staff recommendation is that we forward ZO 0725 to the council with a positive recommendation and a waiver of the second hearing.
Yeah, do you want to rescind? Yeah.
I guess personally, I want to talk with Urban Forester on this general topic, but, so I'm not going to propose adding additional changes.
The
Yeah.
proposed change?
If we, I think
I think-
removing it would be fine. And then we can, again, obviously, we'll be back later this year with other stuff. I don't know if we'll do any tack-ons, but otherwise, I don't think it's so time-sensitive that we couldn't just bring it back with the next update after after gives engineering more time to talk to parks. That would be fine.
Okay. Yeah, no, that sounds great to me. So maybe I can try taking a stab at this. So I move that we forward ZO 0725 to Common Council with a positive recommendation and forego a second hearing while, can I also make an amendment at this? Okay, while amending the section, proposed edit to 20.04.080 F4A to not make the change that's proposed, to keep it at transportation and traffic engineer.
Yep.
Why don't we let's take those one at a time.
Go
Let's
for it.
start with the amendment,
Okay.
just to make sure this
Yeah.
is good. So could, just, if you would, just restate your proposed amendment.
Okay, I move a proposed amendment to remove the proposed change to section 20.04.080 F4A. So it just keeps it as it is today, listing it subject to approval by the transportation and traffic engineer.
Motion and second. Any discussion on that amendment? All right, let's call the roll on that amendment.
Korodke?
Yes.
Kinsey?
Yes.
Smith? Yes. Strasburg?
Yes.
Whistler?
Yes.
Seaboard?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, excellent. Now, I think the motion we'd be looking for is to forward ZO 07-25 as amended to the Common Council with a waiver of the second hearing.
So moved.
All right, any final discussion? Commissioner Strasburg?
That I think that there's also an option on the table that this could be amended at the council level if there's communication that happens between now and the time it goes to council, if that's easier in any way for the planning department than bringing back this potential change in a different way. So just wanted to point that out as an option.
All right. Any other discussion before we call the roll on the motion? All right, let's call the roll.
Kinsey?
Yes.
Smith?
Yes.
Strasburg?
Yes.
Whistler? Seaboard?
Yes.
Korodke?
Yes.
Okay. All right, we are looking at Chapter 3 of the Unified Development Ordinance with this one. Oops, hold on. So Chapter 3 is use regulations. And so I think there are actually only 10 amendments this year in Chapter 3. Sometimes it's also one of our more populated one because we use it, so it has so much information in it. So this year, the amendments deal with a number of things, and I will go ahead and show you. Just a sec. Okay, so first, the one that I mentioned earlier, we have proposed to take out that each individual dwelling unit shall have separate utility meters in both duplexes and then in the regulations for tris and fours. Basically, it was something we had discussed initially when we proposed this language. There were some members of staff who found some information that it isn't uncommon for plexes to share utilities and still be able to be owned separately, which is kind of one of the, home ownership was one of the hopes or purposes of including the plexes. So this does make it difficult for existing buildings to be converted when they are already shared, or existing buildings even that are already plexes to be legitimized, because a lot of times they're already shared utilities. So this, we felt, was creating more issues than helping. So we are proposing to take that out. So again, for all 3 levels of plexes, oops, sorry. All right, so this next portion, that was in the use-specific standards section for those uses. So this is the use-specific standard section for multifamily dwelling. The existing regulation requires that any vehicular parking shall be located 20 feet behind the building facade facing a public street. There has been some discussion in the department about whether or not drive aisles should be included in that, and you have probably heard us talk about that here as well in different site plans, because if part of the desire for having parking set back is for that public-private interface to be better there, then having a drive aisle probably isn't any better than having parking. So we are adding drive aisles directly accessing parking spaces, except that drive aisles are excluded for development sites of half an acre or less. So one of the reasons you haven't seen this before is because we have had a couple of developments develop on sites that are smaller, where they are trying to provide on-site parking for some of their tenants. And if the regulation had been changed at that time to require that drive aisles also couldn't be within 20 feet, then they wouldn't have been able to develop. So because we are trying to encourage small-scale development on infill lots, we are kind of taking those out of the requirement, but acknowledging that on a really large building, it does make sense to have those things set back and have a more active front space. So that's why there's kind of a compromise there based on size. So this is the use-specific standards for ground floor units. This is taken a little bit from the TRO, the newish transform redevelopment overlay. So the current regulation says that in the MD zoning district, each dwelling unit located on the ground floor shall be located at least 20 feet behind the front building facade. So again, trying to have that interface be more public. But we have seen kind of over the last few years, a couple of instances or discussions with people about new buildings where the regulation that is proposed in the TRO could be appropriate, which is that if your building is set close to the property line and that those units could be elevated for kind of like a more walk-up style. One of the concerns that we have heard over the time about having dwelling units on the ground floor in the front of a building is that then everyone just has their blinds closed all the time and their curtains because they feel like they're just like right there on the street, and so that's not really helping a streetscape much anyway. So something that we wrote into the transform redevelopment overlay was that you can have them, but they have to be elevated. So that's something we are going to try in the downtown as well. Mostly will probably only apply to new development because obviously existing developments are at the elevation that they're at, or existing buildings are at the elevation that they're already at, but something that we are wanting to try there. Oops, hold on, sorry. Okay, this is in the use-specific standards for cottage home development. Originally, when the rules were written, we required a project perimeter sidewalk to go around the property, and we have done one, and it just was not going to work very well there based on the size of the property, or based on the characteristics of the property. So we are changing that to a may, still focusing on having those pedestrian connections when we're having those conversations with developers, but taking that out as a requirement. We are also adding that for that same use, that there would be a maximum cumulative area for each unit. At least one development we've seen kind of was like borderline, it's just multifamily on this property, and then, wanting to get a potential package of variances, where it ends up not really being what the cottage home development is trying to be, but just a kind of small multifamily project. And so we are proposing a building max size to kind of get at a more traditional cottage home development design. Okay, so these are the use-specific standards for vehicle fleet operations. They don't currently exist. This will, I don't know if I'm going to explain this well. Yeah.
So this language here is to deal with a possible reuse of a property for autonomous vehicles. So this is something that kind of came to our attention from other communities that have dealt with a situation that they weren't fully prepared for or expecting, where a parking area had just been used and set aside for autonomous vehicles and in essence turned into a surface parking lot. And so we are trying to get a little bit ahead of the curve with that and include that possible use should somebody want to establish that. So we're not aware of any immediate problems or concerns, but this is just some language to, was recommended to be put in to try to help head this off should it come up down the line.
Thank you. And so one thing to note about this is that, when we're doing this update, we aren't proposing any changes to the table. Table 3-1, which is uses, that requires notice to all affected zoning districts. But we are planning to come forward with some changes, and this is one of them where we will clarify where this use is allowed. That will happen probably in concert with the response to the resolution from council, because the notification, last time we did full city notification, it was about $7,000. So we want to make sure we're only doing it once. So we are kind of saving those. So you may see more about this specific use information in the table. Two more, we had, for temporary uses, one issue we run into fairly often is kind of like people putting up pretty large tents and then leaving them up, and we don't really have any good way to regulate them, or businesses asking to put them up, and again, we don't have any way to help them be able to do that that stays code compliant with us and with the building department. And so this would be being able to issue a permit for those structures, which we cannot do now. So getting a temporary permit for like a large tent, if a business was, expanding their seating area for a big event or something like that, like graduation, being able to legitimize that, it would be new for us. And the last one is, again, this is all in the use-specific standards, and I mentioned previously in the sign section as well, allowing temporary signage to be mounted to construction fencing in areas where construction is occurring. So I can answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Jackie. Are there questions from commissioners? Commissioner Stossberg.
Thank you. On the perimeter sidewalks with the cottage development, when you say that they may be required, who gets to make that decision whether or not they're going to be required?
So typically that would fall to the planning director.
Okay, and I guess I just...
Or, because it's a conditional use, the Board of Zoning Appeals could also, I guess, review that as well as part of that.
I guess my concern there is that the whether or not it's required should be determined in a very consistent way. And so without, I guess the question is there guidance somewhere, or where is the guidance that dictates whether or not the sidewalks are going to be required? Because without that guidance, I just think that it opens everybody up to, developers saying, oh, well, you required it over here, but didn't require it over here, and that's not being fair, and I feel like it's a vulnerability.
Sure, that's certainly a very good point. And, we could approach this the same as the tree grade. If you would like to do an amendment, as you are aware, there will be a resolution from council that will deal with the cottage home development, so we can revisit this regulation very soon.
I think that's fine. I also want to say, so like may, we don't often change shalls to mays, but there's like may is in the code like 600 times. Like, that is just part of what we do, is deciding sometimes things are up to the reviewer and whether or not they make sense. And also, like Mr. Grulich pointed out, in this particular case, a conditional use is required. So we always go over those use-specific standards with the Board of Zoning Appeals. And so if, for example, a developer just didn't want to do it, but we felt there was, ample room to do it or need for it, we would make that argument to the Board of Zoning Appeals to include that as a requirement. I think it's kind of like, the one that we did, it didn't work because of the site constraints, right?
Yeah, that, and it didn't serve a purpose. It depends on the arrangement of the site for the cottage homes, a perimeter site, if you've got some situation where it makes sense to have a sidewalk on the outside rather than on an inside corner, then it could be appropriate. So it's a situational thing. So that's why we changed it from a shall to a may, just to put that out there. As Ms. Scanlon said, we know we can analyze that with the use-specific standards as part of the conditional use approval if the situation seems appropriate.
So if I could rephrase, part of the, say, benefit of changing it from a shall to a may is that then it allows that potential exception at the level of the Board of Zoning Appeals?
Yes.
And whereas with a shall, it doesn't allow the exception really at all?
Yeah, so they would have to get a variance then, and prove that there's
Okay.
some hardship.
Which is an extra step in the
Yes.
whole, okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I did have one more question related to I'm still trying to understand the separate utility meters. And I understand what you're saying with regard to difficult if it's a conversion on an existing space. But I guess to me, there's a real lack of incentive for owning these individual units without the separate utilities, the separate utility meters.
I do think we generally agreed with that as well. That's why we proposed, to include it in the original language when it got approved. But then kind of the more we looked into them, in some places, for example, where like Mr. Robinson had worked and lived, it was not uncommon that they were built on one and then they would just split it in some way that didn't actually require them to be two separate accounts, and that is doable in a fairly easy way. So yes, agreed. I do think it makes it seem more cut and dry for ownership if they're separate, but we also are trying to encourage the existing ones to improve and conversions as well, and that makes that really hard for those projects.
Is it possible to distinguish between conversion of existing versus new?
It probably is, yes.
I think there were also some challenges with the City of Bloomington Utilities Department.
Yes.
That they did not want separate meters for each one. They wanted one master meter and then have it billed for each people, each
Thank you for
person.
saying that. I'm sorry, I
That
forgot.
that was really one of the
Utilities
major
preference,
impetuses
too.
for
So
this.
the City of Bloomington Utilities prefer only once shared for their utilities for two or less. So like the way that the state building code is similar, where it's like one code for ones and twos and then one code for everything else. And so that is their preference. That's how they do it now. If you're building three or more, they will require you to do separate utilities. But if you're building ones or twos, they don't. Did I say that right? Yeah, they prefer for it to be one.
For ones and twos?
Yes.
But anything beyond two?
I think that, was it beyond two or beyond four?
It was definitely beyond two.
Okay. We don't think that it's as negatively impactful as we were afraid that it would be when we first, or that we were first concerned that it would be when we wrote it in initially.
Yeah, it just seems to really incentivize, okay, this is
Yeah.
going to be owned by some,
Well, again, you can
Realtor
amend it
or
out
developer.
tonight, and then it is part of the resolution that's coming from, I believe, Councilperson Flaherty. So we could try to gather some more information from CBU, a memo or something for more particular information for you to address it at that time, if you'd prefer. Because that's obviously coming shortly.
yeah, I don't want to make a deal of this if nobody else has this concern, but I do remember thinking about how the spirit of the original use standard was really to encourage ownership and individual owners of each unit.
Right.
And this is one of those things that I think definitely communicates that.
And I'll also just kind of say, we've been tasked with, from a lot of different agencies and groups of how can we lower the hindrances and the costs and barriers to getting more housing within the community. What can we do to make that easier? And as Mrs. Scanlon said, these separate utilities does increase the cost, whether it's an existing building that's being converted, it's a new one that's being constructed. So this was one of those things that could help reduce that barrier, make it more affordable. And so this felt in conjunction with, the challenges with the utilities department. This is something that just kind of seemed appropriate. We certainly agree that we'd love to see the owner occupancy component, but this was not the thing that was getting that.
Yeah, I guess I'm more sympathetic to the conversion of an existing space versus a new development too, but, okay.
I guess, are we, just to clarify, it's only single-family and duplex structures, correct?
The way
So
that
we
it's
really
currently
are only
written, it
talking
is
about
also for
both.
3s and 4s, but you could
Yeah.
take that out as well.
It is for 3s and
Yeah,
4s?
it is, that's why there are two.
That's why there's two, at the top of page 13.
Yeah, darn it.
All right, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, we will go to public comment on Z008-25. If you're here in the chambers, and I don't see anyone here in the chambers, but step on up to the podium, state your name, and you'll have 5 minutes to speak. If you're joining us online, just click the reactions button, click the raise hand option, and we will recognize you when it's your turn to speak. Looks like there's no one online. Last call for public comment. All right, we are then back to the commission for any final discussion or for a motion. Again, as a reminder, the staff recommendation is that we forward Z008-25 to the Common Council with a positive recommendation and a waiver of the second hearing.
I'll just say that while I am torn between the encouragement that I want to give towards expanding housing in these areas, and particularly with both duplexes and anything beyond duplexes, at the same time, I would like to encourage more ownership in these, and I feel like that kind of the separation of separate utility meters really is a sign that that's not really what's being encouraged. But I'm gonna let the housing thing and the need for housing be more important than the ownership part. So I'm gonna take away my concern here, or mitigate my concern. Thanks. Okay, and then with that, unless anybody else.
Well, I would just quickly just respond to say that I think in many ways that does encourage ownership, right? If you're looking to purchase a property but you can't afford, but if you can you can split that property into two and rent half of it out, that makes ownership of that by a family possible in a way that it wouldn't otherwise be. And adding the requirement to separately meter that additional unit makes that property less affordable for the owner who's looking to buy it. So I understand your point, but I think it also in some ways encourages ownership.
Okay, all right, so with that, I will motion to forward let's see, we're at 0825 with a positive recommendation.
And the waiver of second hearing
And a
as well?
waiver of
Thank
second
you.
hearing, yep.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right. Let's call the roll on Z00825.
Smith,
Yes.
Strasburg,
Yes.
Whistler,
Yes.
Seaboard,
Yes.
Korodke,
Yes.
Kinsey.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, motion carries. We are now to our final petition of the evening, Z009-25.
Sorry. Last one of the night, 00925. So this is the remaining three chapters of the UDO. Chapter 5 is subdivision standards, Chapter 6 is administration and procedures, and Chapter 7 is definitions. Again, because it's three chapters, it covers kind of a wide variety. There are 11 total. The first is clarifying that within a Karst Conservancy easement, no mowing is allowed. This is, it previously said mowing is allowed, but in another section of the code in 2004-030G, it is already prohibited. So this is correcting and syncing that language so that those easements aren't disturbed. Here, let's see. This section is in the subdivision control, and it basically lists those things you can do with your property lines that won't require subdivision, and those things are largely outlined by state code, but we are allowed to require some development standards to those. So the ones last year, maybe the year before, we added that the lots could not be reduced below the minimum zoning requirements of Chapter 2. And then this year, there are 3 items in Chapter 5 related in the subdivision control chapter of the code related to design standards. So they are related to the depth to width ratio, that a lot, so that we don't get a lot of long skinny lots or lots that aren't regularly shaped. And so that's what these code references are too. So we are adding those in as well, that if you're doing what we call colloquially a lot line shift adjustment, so that's these 2 sections here that both have amendments proposed, that you cannot take those out of regular design standards that you would otherwise be held to if you were doing the subdivision. So not all of them, of course, but just the ones that help with regular lot design. Something we are proposing to remove here is development located within 500 feet, measured radially from the center of 37 and 69. That is from the old zoning code and is not very applicable anymore. We broke, just because of the size of that right-of-way, I think is largely why, and just the areas that have been developed along that portion already. For demolition delay, we're not proposing new language, we're just proposing to break up the applicability into 2 sections, so it's a little bit easier to reference and understand. And then for floodplain development permit, our newish floodplain development administrator, Rachel Johnson, has been working closely with the state to understand kind of like where we are with our regulations and our permitting and how those work with their expectations. So this is exempting some activities from requiring a floodplain development permit. So that is the installation of underground utilities that do not require any fill, construction of sidewalks or similar features at existing grade, and signs. So those all seem like common sense, but they are something that we want to codify because the state agreed it was unclear whether or not those were required. This is for our nonconforming structures section. So lawful nonconforming structure may continue in its existing condition, however, it may not increase the degree of nonconformity with any development standard unless as expressly permitted below. This is different. This is different than the old reading, which was unless and until limited compliance with the development standards or full is required. So this becomes difficult for development when there are lawful nonconforming structures and they're going to develop the property. Then they have to bring the property into limited compliance, and that can be difficult with a structure that exists already and doesn't meet setbacks and kind of necessitates more variances than makes sense to do, so we're changing the regulation slightly. And this is related to that as well. When doing full compliance, if you are on a site, for example, that already has a building and you're building new buildings, then your existing building doesn't have to come into compliance with obviously the setbacks or architecture or height, things that are already existing there. And that is a big change for us because typically we, because of the way the code reads, require variances for those existing structures. We did some clarification here related to fencing. Those components referenced earlier in the code, that those are the ones that must be removed if you have a non-compliant fence. And then we are looking at, in our definition of impervious surface, kind of syncing with what we're trying to get at with gravel or stone and counting those as impervious surface in the definition. And then our last change is related to the vehicle fleet operations, clarifying, adding into the definition specifically autonomous vehicle services and refueling as well to update that definition related to the use-specific standards we discussed earlier. And yeah, that's all we have, so I can answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions from commissioners? Anyone have a question? All right, it's all crystal clear. Any public comment on Z009-25? Is there anyone online? Last call for public comment? All right, we're back to the commission for any final discussion or for a motion. Tron?
Just one comment, and I really like this section where it talks about the non-conforming lots and kind of, I really applaud the administration to be addressing that, because as we update our ordinances, this causes an indirect impact on some properties. And I think looking at a way that relieves some of that burden and allows them to continue to do some things on their property is a great compromise, and I really appreciate them bringing this amendment forward.
Any other discussion or motion? Commissioner Stossberg?
I guess I'll also say that I appreciate that there are a few things, specifically in this one, but also in the earlier ones, that eliminated the need for variances. And that just streamlines processes for everybody a little bit. So I appreciate that y'all are looking out for that. So thanks.
Hear, hear. The staff recommendation is that we forward this to the Common Council with a positive recommendation and a waiver of the second hearing. Would someone like to make a motion to that effect?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All right. Jackie, would you please call the roll?
Stossberg?
Yes.
Whistler?
Yes.
Seabour?
Yes.
Korodke?
Yes.
Kinsey?
Yes.
And Smith?
Yes.
Thank you.
That motion carries. And that is our conclusion of our agenda this evening. So unless there are any final announcements, we will adjourn. We're adjourned. Thank you.